Now, what's this here? Is this a hanging crowd?
You know, if you don't be nice to me, it might turn into one.
Oh, is that so? Well, I figured if you was going to bring a group of people to see me hang, you would have brought more people. I can think of at least 50 people in this county like to see that.
Yeah, but be careful, I might be one of them.
Well, I counted you as one.
Oh, well, thank you. No, these actually, I think it'd be best to call them curiosity seekers.
Oh, I see.
They came into the courthouse building a few minutes ago, wondering a little bit about the surrender. Yeah, I saw you out here being awful busy on the porch there. I thought maybe you could spend a moment of your time with them.
Yes, I have been right busy today. I've been holding down that porch all day long. So as you notice, hasn't gone anywhere.
No, you're doing a pretty good job.
I take great pride in my work. Yeah, so right quick with it. You just want me to jaw with these folks here?
Is that what y'all like?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
All
I guess
right,
that's
well,
right.
I'd be happy to do that. You best get back into that courthouse before Mr. Pierce finds out you're gone.
Yeah, he'll take the kingdom of back.
That's right. Liable to have your hide.
He's the county clerk. He's my boss. So.
And he's a hard man, too.
Well, I really appreciate this, Mr. Coleman.
Yes, ma'am.
You have a good day, and you
All
folks
right.
do too.
Yeah, fetch yourself back in there. I'll take care of these folks.
Thank you very much.
How y'all?
Fine.
Good.
So now, as I understand it, y'all fancy some stories of the war and the late unpleasantness and what have you?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'd be happy to jaw with y'all about those things. If you just like to come over there to that shade porch with me, you could sit down in the comfort, and after y'all have found your comfort, I'll give you the war stories over there. Now, how's that sound to y'all?
Sounds good.
Yeah, I figured you'd be amenable to that. Follow me. Yeah, there you are. Just find a seat right up here on this porch, and after y'all have done that, I'll be with you directly. Ladies, how do y'all do? Ladies, I just keep this hat on. How you do, friend? We're good. So, as I've understood things to be, y'all are curiosity seekers, is that so?
Yes, sir.
People with more money and time on their hands they know what to do with. Yeah, that's all right. We got plenty of y'all down here in the South. We call y'all Texans. Any of y'all from Texas?
No.
I see that the Lord's been good to us today. Hey, let me tell you something about these Texas people, all right? If you ever met one, you would know precisely what I speak of. They fancy that everything in Texas is bigger and better than you got it where you're from. Wouldn't that be your experience, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Well, see, the first time I ever met a Texan, I was in military encampment. I was learning the school of the soldiers, as a matter of fact, how to march straight and shoot straight right when I first enlisted. And you see, we would have camps adjacent to one another. And it was always a sport of mine to go around and ask people where they was from. So I went over and I went into the next camp over, and I saw a fella that I hadn't seen in those parts before. And I walked right up to him. And I said, "Hello, friend. I'm from Virginia. Where are you from?" And the fella just looked at me. And so I repeated myself. I figured he didn't hear me the first time. So I said, "Hello, friend. I'm from Virginia. Where are you from?" And the fella, he just stared at me. So I figured he was deaf. And so I says it a third time so he could read my lips. I said, "Hello, friend. I am from Virginia. Where are you from?" And he said, "Don't you know you never ask a man where he's from?" And I said, "Oh, why's that?" He said, "Because if the man ain't from Texas, you're going to make him real ashamed to say so. And if he is from Texas, you're going to force the man to brag on himself." Well, being that I'm from Virginia, I didn't like that response too much, so I determined I was going to teach that boy a lesson. So I pitched out into the swamp, all right? And remember, this is out about Richmond City where the river come through and it makes all these fine tributaries and swamps. And so I went out there and poked around for a bit. And after about 10 minutes, I found a snapping turtle whose shell must have been about that big. So I picked up that snapping turtle shell real quick and I put it into my coat and I slid back into the camp. Well, I made my way back into camp. And the first Texas blanket I found, I picked up that blanket and I slid that snapping turtle right on in there and I closed up the edges just so that he wouldn't escape. And I pitched back into the swamp and I waited for the fireworks to commence. Well, I waited for about a quarter of an hour. And surely enough, here come those Texans back from their maneuvers. And so they broke ranks and each one of them went back towards their blankets. And wouldn't y'all know that by some curious turn of luck, that same loudmouth braggart that I'd been jawing with earlier was the one who walked up to that blanket where I put the snapping turtle. And that fella, he came off with his shoes there, and he set them off to the side, and before he slid into the blanket, he said, "Yeah, boys, I guess we've had a good day of it. We went out on maneuvers, and we told those Virginians that everything they got in Virginia is smaller and inferior to the things we have in Texas." Well, no sooner than those words had escaped his lips, he slid down into that blanket, and as soon as he got his foot to the bottom, he leapt out of that blanket 10 feet into the air. And he screamed to the top of his lungs, you see. He was saying, help me, boys. What is this terrible creature that's got a hold of me?" And I looked, and surely enough, that snapping turtle had latched onto his foot. And that boy, he's just crying and hollering and screaming to the tops of his lungs. And he fell down the ground. He started turning himself in circles, saying, "Help me, boys. What is this terrible thing that's got me? What is this terrible creature that's got a hold of me?" And I picked my head up out the swamp. I said, "Don't you worry about that, Texas. All that is a Virginia bed bug." Well, I guess that Texas boy learned that not everything in Texas is bigger or better than we got it in Virginia. Now, y'all are curiosity seekers, right?
Right.
Well, if you are curiosity seekers, I reckon some of y'all must have gotten up there to New York City to see those curiosities. Y'all ever been up there?
Yes.
Ma'am, did you see Barnum's Circus Museum?
No.
Well, you missed the order of the day. Up there at Barnum Circus Museum, they have all manner of things for y'all to look at. Why, they've got a mermaid held in captivity at Barnum Circus Museum. There's a tiger held in a cage at Barnum Circus Museum. And for an extra 10 cents, you could even see a woman with a full face of hair. And for an extra 5 cents on top of that, you get to tug on a beard. They call her the bearded lady. Now, would y'all pay 15 cents to tug on a bearded lady's beard? Be honest with me. Ma'am, I don't blame you. Because here in Appomattox County, we got a whole slew of bearded ladies. We don't charge y'all nothing to have a tug on them. Hey, not only does Barnum have a tiger and a mermaid and a bearded lady in his collection of curious things, but he's also got a full-grown man that is but that high off the ground. And his name is General Tom Thumb. Now, you ladies, you've heard of Tom Thumb before, haven't you? Why, he sings and he dances, and I understand he's got a good impression of Napoleon, too. But during the war, old Tom Thumb, he quit singing and dancing. And people would come through to see him sing and dance, and all he'd be doing is sitting on a cracker box holding his head in his hands. And the reason he was so down at the mouth was because he was melancholy. He had yet to find a lady little enough to marry. Now tell me, honey, ain't that the saddest thing you ever heard?
It's the saddest thing.
Yes, it is. It grieves my heart, too. And so Barnum, P.T. Barnum, he might be a Connecticut Yankee, but he does have enough of a heart to do something about that. And so he commenced to taking himself throughout the North, and this was during the war, mind you, and P.T. Barnum took himself out to the one state up north that's round on both ends and high up in the middle. Do y'all know which state that is?
Ohio.
Yeah, that's right, it's Ohio. You see, it's round on both ends and high in the... Just forget it. So anyway, P.T. Barnum, he went out there to Ohio and found a woman that high off the ground and offered to pay her a little money to go out yonder to New York City to meet Tom Thumb, maybe even take sweet on the man. Well, she went out there and she met Tom Thumb, and wouldn't you know that come a year later, those two dwarves will stand inside the church building and they's fixing to exchange the holy vows of matrimony. Now, that's a pleasant story, ain't it?
It is.
But you see, P.T. Barnum, he's a Connecticut Yankee. All right? Any of y'all from Connecticut?
My family's from Connecticut.
All right, now what about you yourself?
I'm from South Florida.
Well, I guess that'll pass. I'd say you got the better end of the trade, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Well, now, you, ma'am, you don't mind if I sport on you?
No,
Sir,
no,
you don't mind if I sport
No,
on you, lady,
please,
do you?
please do. Go right ahead.
All right. Now, y'all watch this lady
Please
here.
do.
Now, she might be from Florida, but she comes from Connecticut. Stop. All right? And let me tell you something about these Connecticut people. They have one thing on their mind and one thing alone, and that is to get the dime out your pocket. And P.T. Barnum, he ain't no different. He was out there in front of the church building the day Tom Thumb got married, and he's trying to sell tickets. 10 cents a piece to get in there and see Tom Thumb getting hitched. And as I understand it, people came back after the wedding with their tickets still in hand, and they were not happy. They started pounding their fists into their hands, saying, now see here, P.T. Barnum, we are not satisfied with this service, and we hereby demand our money back. You know why they're so upset, don't you? The way Biden was too short. That's what we call in the South 2/3 of a pun. P.U. Y'all didn't come to hear things about tigers and mermaids and snapping turtles. Y'all probably came to hear something about the war, and shame on me for carrying forth as I have. But I can tell y'all something about the war and what occurred here last April. But if I'm to sufficiently describe to y'all all those things that occurred here, I would need to begin the story out in the city of Petersburg, which is a good 100 miles out here to the east. Now, into that city of Petersburg, they'll run 4 very important railroads. Those 4 railroads connect the city of Petersburg to all the rest of the South. Now, in turn, there's a 5th rail line, and it leaves Petersburg and it runs up to the north to Richmond City, 25 miles away. So, needless to say, Richmond is connected to all the rest of the South by way of Petersburg and its railroads. So y'all would understand very plain how important Petersburg with its railroads would be to the welfare of Richmond, and because Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, to the entire Confederacy. But the Yanks, they didn't understand the importance of Petersburg for the first 3 years of the war. No, they aimed to take Richmond by direct assault each time. And this is the way they do it. All right, they take an army up there in Northern Virginia. And old Lincoln, he'd find a commander for that army. And when he found a commander for that army, he'd send those boys after Richmond. They get whipped, and they come back to old Lincoln with their tails tucked between their legs. Lincoln, he'd pluck out the old commander, put in a new one, send them after Richmond. Then they get whipped. Then they come back to old Lincoln with their tails between their legs. Lincoln, pluck out the old commander, put in a new one, send them after Richmond. And that's the ebb and flow of things for 3 years. That's how it went. But I guess you could say that by the process of trial and error, that old Lincoln finally found his man, a fella from out west, and I'm certain y'all have heard tell the name Grant. Well, Grant, he come out here to the east spring of last year, and he took command of that federal army, and he determined he didn't care who got in his way. He was going to get into Richmond or die trying. All right? So he take his army throughout Northern Virginia, and each time Grant's army met our army on the field of battle, I'd say that we gave him the worst of it. But no matter to Grant, because up there in the north, they got twice the population that we do down here in the south. And so needless to say, we couldn't afford to lose men on the battlefield, but he could. He'd just call up reinforcements and keep moving forward. As a matter of fact, Grant's army kept moving so far forward, they bypassed the city of Richmond altogether and instead concentrated on Petersburg. And I think y'all understand why. You see, old Grant might not have been the smartest man to come out of West Point, but he is a master of the obvious, which in my opinion is worth 2 smart men. You see, old Grant, he understood very plain that if he took Petersburg's supply lines away from Richmond, he'd simply starve Richmond into subjection. He wouldn't have to fight for the city. And so, the long and the short of it is, when Grant's army came for Petersburg, we were waiting for him, and we kept him out of the city, and we maintained our hold on Richmond and Petersburg for the next 9.5 months as a result. But all during the 9.5 months that Grant's army held our army in siege around Richmond and Petersburg, what he was trying to do is stretch out our army because he understood that his army was twice the size of our own. And if he just simply stretched out his lines, we'd have to stretch out with them. By the time it was all over, we had been stretched out to our breaking point, something like 40 miles long from the north of Richmond to the southwest of Petersburg and places in between. And with our army drawn out like it was, we couldn't protect those 4 rail lines like we would have cared to. And by the end of the siege, the Yankees had captured 3 of the 4 rail lines. But there was one still in our hands. The railroad that was still in our hands was called the Southside Railroad. Now, with a name like the Southside Railroad, where would y'all expect that to come from?
The South?
The South. That makes perfect sense, don't it? But remember, you are in Virginia after all. We don't always make sense around here. You see, the Southside Railroad, it comes into Petersburg from, of all places, the west. And it was the one railroad that kept Petersburg in our hands, Richmond in our hands, and all of our armies safely behind entrenchments. So if the Yanks aimed to kick us out of Richmond and Petersburg, they would first have to take the Southside Railroad, now wouldn't they? Well, they commenced in earnest to doing that come the springtime of this year, 65, late March and early April. Grant was sending his 5th Corps and Sheridan's cavalry down southwest of Petersburg, poking around, looking for the extreme right flank of our army. And they found our right flank rested at a place called 5 Forks in Dinwiddie County. And on April Fool's Day, the Yanks, they pitched right on in. They took something like 5,000 of our boys prisoner, and all the rest of the boys in that fight who was supposed to be maintaining our right flank, They turned their tails to the Yanks, and they ran so quick from the battle, you would have sworn that they were all from Texas. And that meant that the Southside Railroad was just about in the enemy's hands. But you see, old Grant, he ain't gonna take a rail line and just wait for us to leave town whenever we're good and ready to do it. Not Grant. That's a vicious bulldog of a man. Once he gets a good hold to you, he don't let go. And that's why the next day, April the 2nd, he pitched into us another time. And that second assault broke our lines in 3 separate places. With our lines busted and mangled as they were, and with no supply lines to draw off of, General Lee knew very plain that we couldn't be carrying on to hold on to Richmond and Petersburg too much longer. So under the cover of dark, April the 2nd, we picked up out of those entrenchments, and we started marching off to the west. We retreated, we let out. With that, I guess the enemy was free and clear to mince right on into Richmond and Petersburg and take possession of those 2 cities without even a shot fired. But while we were right depressed to lose our capital to the enemy, we were happy to get out of those entrenchments. And we were once again an army on the move and no longer tied down to one place. And with our newfound freedom, General Lee had a new plan for us. And the plan was this. You see, we'd simply take our army out of Virginia here and get down into North Carolina there, where there was another Confederate army waiting on us. The Army of Tennessee under the command of General Johnston. You see, the way I fancy it, if we could have just gotten our boys out of Virginia and down into Carolina, we'd simply take those 2 armies, put them together to make one grand army, and with that grand army, that combined force, we'd simply pitch to the south, we'd whip Sherman, and once we were done with Sherman's army, we'd turn to the north and whip that devil Grant too. But if any of that had any prospect of happening, we would have to get out to a place called Amelia Courthouse, where food was waiting on us. You see, Amelia Courthouse is just west of Petersburg. And the rails come through right there. And the way I understood things was the government had promised to have a train filled with food that we could provide ourselves with once we arrived at Amelia Courthouse. But we would have to arrive there ahead of the Federal Army. Well, we held up our end of the bargain. We got to Amelia Courthouse on April the 4th, and surely enough, there was that train pulled up at the rail depot just as it had been promised. So all the hungry boys out of my army, we gathered around them trains thinking that we was going to get something good to eat. We opened up the rail car doors, we peered inside, and there was nothing on those railroad cars but ammunition, artillery shells, and new uniforms. No food, because somebody in the Confederate government had sent us the wrong train. Well, you can't feed no army. You gave me a look like that's what you expect when you're dealing with the government, right? Well, you can't feed no army on ammunition, artillery shells, and new uniforms. You're going to have to give boys food if you expect them to march and fight. It was Napoleon who said years ago that an army marches and fights on its stomach or its belly. That's right. And so that's why the remainder of the 4th, General Lee was sending us out into the countryside to forage and pick for whatever food we could find lying about. And as we're out there looking for food, who do you think had plenty of time to catch up to us? That's right, old Grant's army. And they made up for the day's lead that we had on them. They cut us off to the south, and so needless to say, we had no place to go but to the west. And that's where we lit out, and the enemy was hot on our heels. Next day was April the 5th. And I mean to tell y'all that it was, after all, the first week of April. And if y'all spend any time in Virginia, you know that during the first week of April, the rains come down and our roads become little more than quagmire. And so when you step into a Virginia road during the first week of April, that road's liable to come up past your knee. Well, we was marching and traveling along in all that heavy, thick mud. And as we were pulling along, I remember looking around from time to time and seeing that there were boys in our army who had taken articles off their person and pitching them off to the side of the road just to make things a little bit lighter for their feet. I saw one man about 3 columns ahead of me break ranks long enough to take off his shoes, and he pitched them off to the side of the road. I guess he figured he'd be better off without his shoes. And so then another man came past the same spot, saw those 2 shoes laying off to the side of the road, figured he'd be better off without his coat. So off went his coat, contrary to military regulation, and he pitched that coat down on top of them shoes and kept on about his way. And then a third man happened along and figured he'd be better off without his hat. So off went his hat, and he pitched it down on top of that pile of clothes. And so what y'all had there was a pair of shoes, and a coat sitting on top of that, and a hat sitting on top of everything. So me and my messmate Charlie Farrar came past the same spot. Charlie, he looked over to the side of the road, and he saw that pile of clothes laying there, and he reached over and he dug me in the ribs and he said, Henry, turn around, look at that pile of clothes laying over there on the side of the road. What do you suppose a pile of clothes would be laying over there for? And I looked at that pile of clothes and I said, oh, that could only be one thing. That's where somebody took and let all the hot air out of a Texan. So we kept marching along down that muddy road, and we marched all day of the 5th and into the 6th as well. And we got out east of Farmville to a place known to the local people as Sailor's Creek, all right? And the place out there, it's rather curious. You wouldn't expect to find so many deep cuts and ravines that far east in Virginia, but surely enough, there's some steep hills over there. And in one of those little ravines, a little creek comes through, and they call it Little Sailor's Creek. Well, we were going down to the bottom there, and as we were marching down to the bottom so we could ford over the creek, one of our military commanders, in all of his infinite knowledge, decided that it would be best to take our wagons from the rear of the army, where wagons belong, and put our wagons up in front of my corps and behind General Longstreet's corps that was up ahead of us. All right? So we got down there to that bottom, over went General Longstreet's corps, and then when it came the wagons' turn, well, they started to get stuck in the mud because of all the recent rains. The creek had swollen over its banks. And so when the wagons got stuck, all the boys behind those wagons, they started to pile up like water at a dam. And when that occurred, the boys on the other side of the creek, they kept marching on like there wasn't a care in the world. And that meant that now there's a big gap in our lines. And when the enemy saw that gap in our lines, Federal cavalry poured in. They swooped down into that gap like a vulture. And then they cut off our piece of the army from all the rest. And before long, we was quickly surrounded by Federal infantry, and the Battle of Sailor's Creek commenced. The battle didn't last too long, though. Went on for something like 45 minutes. But at the end of that 3/4 of an hour, they captured away from us 8,000 men and 8 of our generals. One of our general officers that was bagged out, China, was none other than General Ewell himself, one of General Lee's corps commanders, I tell you. And the way I hear tell, they bagged General Lee's oldest son out there too. But despite the fact that we had just lost 8,000 men and 8 general officers, we were still marching off to the west, trying to get away from the enemy, and they were still nipping at our heels. Next day, April the 7th, we marched 21 miles all throughout that thick, heavy mud. And the next day, April the 8th, we marched an additional 21 miles through the thick, heavy mud. All the while, our officers were sitting up on top of their horses, riding up and down the lines, looking down their long noses at us, saying things like, yeah, that's right, man, y'all keep moving now. Put one foot in front of the other and do it over again. That's all there is to marching. They said the boys with the best feet are the ones who are going to win this war. Well, I don't know about y'all, but I think if I was sitting up on top of an animal and he was doing all my walking for me, maybe I'd be a little more enthusiastic about the subject of marching too. One way or the other, we marched all day of the 7th, all day of the 8th, until we got right over here to this 3-mile long narrow valley, and on one bank the Appomattox River. For those of y'all who are sitting right here at the edge of the porch, y'all can see it real plain from where you're sitting. Right over there, in that narrow little valley, is where the vast portion of our army was assembled and encamped the night of April the 8th. And I don't think I need to impart too much military wisdom to the rest of y'all to have you realize that when you can take and put the vast portion of an army inside of a 3-mile long narrow valley and on one bank of a river, it ain't saying too much for your army's strength. You see, we had left Richmond and Petersburg the night of April 2nd. We had with us something like 60,000 men. When we arrived there here 6 days later, of the 60,000 men we started with, we had 30,000 remaining. So in other words, we had lost half our army in less than 1 week. And what was left of our army? There were 2 Yankee corps here to the east, making their camp. We could tell that by their campfires. And here to the south, there was the campfires of another Yankee corps. And over here to the southwest, the Yankee 24th and 25th Corps had swung out in front of us during the evening, and they had put themselves out in front of us. But on this one road west of town, the road to continued retreat and a prolonged war. Judging by the campfires, there was but one enemy division out there making camp. When you ask anybody, no 2,000-man division is going to hold back 30,000 hungry Southerners. I don't care how good they are. So the next morning of April 9th, General Lee must have figured the same thing. because he sent 9,000 men out of my corps, the finest corps in the army, the 2nd Corps of the Army. That's General Gorham's corps, ma'am. We came up this ridge right here into town, and it was our task to go move that enemy division off that road. So all 9,000 men out of my corps came up into town here, past the courthouse, and past Mr. Meek's store right yonder. Then we commenced to deploying our battle lines out there in that field west of town, and as soon as we had done that, we picked up over that ridge, looking for that enemy division guarding the road out of town. Now, that morning of April 9th, it was fairly foggy. And it was so foggy in some places, you'd be hard-pressed to see your own hand in front of your face. But even though the fog was so heavy out there on them hills, didn't stop us from finding out who that enemy division was. We found out they was just a division of Custer's cavalry. And you ask anybody, no federal cavalry is going to stand up against Southern infantry. As a matter of fact, federal cavalry don't stand up to much of anything. See, there's no better way for me to express to y'all my personal opinion of a cavalryman than to tell y'all walk into a cavalry encampment sometime and you'd see precisely what I mean. Just take yourself into an army camp sometime, and this is how you find your way around. All you have to do to find out what branch of the service that you are visiting, just look at the stripes on the non-commissioned officer sleeves. All right? Let me give you an example. You walk into an army camp and you see men wearing blue stripes on their sleeve, you know automatically that you are in the midst of the infantry, because infantry's designated color is that of blue. All right? You walk into an artillery encampment and you see a man wearing red stripes, because the designated color for the artillery is that of red. But if you walk into a cavalry encampment, you don't see no blue stripes, and you don't see no red stripes on the men's sleeves neither. And that's because the designated color for the cavalry is...
Yellow.
Is it yellow?
Yeah, it is yellow. And those boys in the infantry, we figured that they couldn't pick the better color for the cavalry, because those cavalry boys are right fond of showing them yellow colors, if you take my meaning. No sooner than we pitched into that enemy cavalry, they jumped on top of their animals and they legged it out of town as fast as those animals' legs could carry them. And that meant the road west, the road to Lynchburg, the road to a continued retreat was wide open. So I guess you could say about that time we was calling back to the remainder of camp, saying, "Come on now, boys, bring up the army, for the way is clear. Let us continue on our retreat." But no sooner than we could have gotten those boys mobilized, the blessed hand of Providence reached down out of heaven and commenced to clearing away all that heavy fog. And when the fog lifted, we could still see that enemy cavalry moving in our front, running away from us. But coming up in the cavalry's support was reinforcements. 12,000 Yank infantry. And the infantry don't run so easy. But I know what y'all are thinking right now. Y'all are thinking, 12,000 Yanks against 9,000 Southerners? Oh, that's not a fair fight for the Yanks. And under normal circumstances, you'd be exactly right. Because under normal circumstances, they would have to have us by a 2-to-1 advantage before they could even entertain the thought of whipping us on the field of battle. Why, you remember what they said when this war started anyway, don't you? That one Southern boy could easily whip a dozen Yankees? Remember all that talk? Mm-hmm. Well, friend, now that the war's over, I guess we all know that that's just exaggeration, ain't it?
Yeah.
One Southerner whipping a dozen Yankees, that's preposterous. Everybody knows it takes 2 of us. One way or the other, it was not a matter of numbers that was the determining factor between those two armies on that day. It was a mere question of supplies. All along this retreat, the Yank army ate, and my army didn't. As a matter of fact, by the time my corps gathered here for this fight, we hadn't had a lick of food in 4 days. And y'all remember what I was telling you earlier about how an army marches and fights on its stomach?
Right.
Well, you got an empty stomach. What kind of soldier do you have? An empty one. And so when the enemy commenced their counterattack into us, I guess you could say that our resolve more or less dissolved. And our get up and go, it got up and went. And so they chased us down off that ridge and they pushed us through the village here and they stuck us right over there into that hollow. And before long, we started to see white flags departing our lines in the direction of the enemy.